Of course, I have a few brief announcements to make that I'd like to share with you. Apparently, the ice storm has passed. Again, please make sure to turn your cell phones off and put them on silent. And I'd like to share with you some travel grant opportunities for graduate students that you may not be aware of, because this is our first year being able to offer them. So if you're wondering, graduate students, how to get some funds to come here, one way is through the Sarah B. McCraw Graduate Student Travel Grant Award and Competition. Sarah B. McCraw was an assistant professor at East Carolina University. She received her Bachelor of Science from James Madison University, her Bachelor of Science in Early Childhood Education from the University of Maryland, and an MEd and a PhD from the University of Delaware. She was also an active member in LRA and especially in the graduate student associations. So this travel grant is part of her legacy. It is intended to offset the cost of presenting original early literacy research at the annual conference, and grants can be used for travel-related expenses associated with this conference: airfare, hotel meals, parking, transfer, and rental car, all the things that you would want it to, and also for registration fees. To qualify, applicants have to be doctoral students in good standing and have received confirmation from LRA that their conference proposals were accepted for the conference. Applicants must also be the sole or first author on their conference presentations. The applicant's research must focus on some aspect of early literacy teaching and learning in school or community contexts. And grants are awarded competitively based on the significance of the research, the clarity of the proposal, and the potential of the research to influence early literacy teaching and learning, which were Sarah's passions. This year's recipients were and are, and if you are present, please do stand: Lisa Hawkins from Michigan State University, Meredith Labadie from the University of Missouri St. Louis, and Stephanie Strachan from Michigan State University. And so next year, this exact same competition will go on, and if you would like further information about the Sarah B. McCraw Literacy Fund, you can go to the website depicted there, or you can contact John Offelhaven at the University of Maryland. Today, I am honored to let you know a few more announcements. The town hall will follow immediately after this plenary with our moderators Christine Malazzi from the University of Kentucky and Sturge Butsakis from the University of Tennessee. That will be just next door in Salons F and G, right back there. And if you've never attended it, it's a wonderful treat to see everybody engaged in lively debate and conversation. Immediately following that will be the memorial service for our colleagues who have passed away in this current year. And then later tonight, we will, of course, have the doctoral student ICG happy hour from 8 to 10, and vital issues beginning at 9, so they'll overlap. It's good that the doctoral students and everybody else will mix. That's great. So meet in Coral's Lounge in the lobby level. Next, we will have the Distinguished Scholar Lifetime Achievement Award, followed by the Early Career Achievement Award, and then we will have our plenary address. First, I'd like to introduce Jane Hansen, who is the chair of the Distinguished Scholar Lifetime Achievement Award.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an interesting crowd. They're all over there. All right, all to my right. I'll begin by telling you a bit about this award. The purpose of the Distinguished Scholar Lifetime Achievement Award is to honor persons who have had a significant impact on the field of literacy. The award acknowledges outstanding individuals who have not been actively involved in LRA, but whose lifetime work, nevertheless, has had a major influence on our LRA membership. Decisions about who should be the recipients are the responsibility of a committee, and I'll announce their names, so those present may please stand. Paula Schwanenflugel, Lisa Zabolinski, Margaret Mary Solentic Dowell, Elizabeth Jagger, and Judy Scott. In addition, I thank Gerald Campano and Rob Simon, who worked especially hard to pull together the nomination needed for this nomination. All the work and all the information, they pulled it together. Plus, 10 members of LRA wrote letters of endorsement, so thank you to all of you. At this time, now that I've told you about the process, and before I tell you about their accomplishments, rather than keep it a secret, which is, I realize, not the customary order for awards at this conference, I am proud to announce that our 2014 co-awardees are Marilyn Cochran-Smith and Susan Lytle. Now to their accomplishments, to some of them. Currently, Susan is Professor Emerita from the University of Pennsylvania. Marilyn holds the John Cawthorn Endowed Chair in Teacher Education for Urban Schools at Boston College. The two together have greatly influenced the evolution of teachers as researchers and are often considered to be founders of that avenue of inquiry. Said another way, they are responsible for leading a paradigm shift regarding the locations of knowledge. In 1993, they co-authored the book that put them on the map, Inside Outside, Teacher Research and Knowledge. In it, they argue for and show the importance of knowledge generated not only by university-based professors, but also by classroom teachers, often working in communities of inquiry. 16 years later, in 2009, Susan and Marilyn co-authored their second book, Inquiry as Stance, Practitioner Research for the Next Generation, in which they continue to argue for the significance of practitioner-generated knowledge. During the 16 years between their two books, they were co-principal investigators for a Spencer Grant on teacher inquiry. They co-authored several articles and book chapters. And in 1995, they started a book series with Teachers College Press that continues till this day. For it, teachers, administrators, researchers, and teacher educators write about their own practice. And over the years, 14 titles have been published. Preceding their groundbreaking book in '93, they had written other articles, including, in 1990, an article titled Research on Teaching and Teacher Research, The Issues That Divide. As of April 2014, 24 years after the article came out, this article was listed as the third most cited article in the history of educational researcher. LRA members in those 10 letters of endorsement that I mentioned say the following about Susan and Marilyn. So here are a few quotes. They serve as exemplary models of how to live a life in inquiry. The Spencer Foundation has created a program of research in Dr. Lytle's name. They create a hopeful future for students whose teachers take up inquiry as stance. When Inside Outside was published in 1993, it would have been impossible to anticipate that the Academy would eventually view practitioner inquiry as a legitimate form of research. And now my own comment. When I started a new position at the University of Virginia in 2000, which would have been 7 years after the book, I submitted a proposal to the IRB for research in which there would be teachers as researchers, and it was promptly declined because teachers not only aren't but weren't going to be seen as researchers. But so I took my little information and I walked around and peddled my point of view, met with the head of IRB, and yes, they finally approved my research project. Now, finally, the last quote of all. I saved the best one till last. Susan Lytle and Marilyn Cochran Smith are hedgehogs. According to the Greek poet, philosopher Archilochus, the fox knows many things, the hedgehog one big thing. While Susan and Marilyn indeed know many things, their focus has been steadfast on one big thing, practitioner inquiry. Susan and Marilyn present their own session tomorrow morning at 10:30. So we hope to see all of you there. Marilyn and Susan, congratulations. Come forward. Come up here. She will take a picture. Oh, thank you. Susan. Let's take our picture. Oh, they're giving a nice applause. Thank you very much. That's very sweet.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Thank you. Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Diane Lapp, who is the chair of the Early Career Achievement Award.
This award's at the other end of the spectrum. Before I introduce the Early Career Award winner for 2014, I'd like to mention that this yearly award was established in 1999 to recognize the work of one LRA member who, in the early part of his or her career, has demonstrated outstanding commitment and accomplishment to the field of literacy through his research, teaching, and service. As a member of LRA for several decades, I was thrilled to read the papers of this year's nominees. They were excellent. Serving on this committee makes obvious the fact that we're in good hands, because there are so many wonderful young scholars coming up through the ranks of LRA. The work of this committee was done by members who very rigorously scrutinized the materials of numerous excellent nominees. I'd like to introduce the committee members, and when I call their names, if they're here, please stand. Janet Gaffney, Susan Hopewell, Pam Mason, Melissa Mosley Wetzel, Seth Parsons, Sheila Ray, Jeannie Swafford, and Ann Taboda, and our board liaison, Cynthia Lewis. Thank you for all of your work on selecting the 2014 awardee, Dr. Amy Hutchinson from Iowa State University, who was nominated by Dr. David Rankin. Dr. Hutchinson's work focuses on the integration of digital technology and literacy instruction to both enhance traditional literacy and promote digital literacy skills. And secondly, to support and prepare teachers to integrate digital technology into literacy instruction in meaningful and effective ways. She's done a lot in a few short years. She's had 17 articles published or in press in juried journals. She's completed 3 book chapters. She has a book under contract. She's written and had funded 7 grants. And the result from one of these grants involving the use of iPads was published in the Reading Teacher. But listen to this. It resulted in receiving 11,839 downloads. It was the second most downloaded article in the journal in 2012. Amy has also held leadership positions in national and international professional organizations, and her Iowa State colleagues attest to her as being an outstanding teacher educator who, in the history of the tradition of LRA, invites their students to become members of their research teams. So I think we can all look forward to seeing continued accomplishments of Dr. Hutchinson, and I'm very proud to be the one to give her this award.
Thank you. This is such an honor. As I started to come to LRA about 9 years ago as a first-year doctoral student, I have given celebrity status in my mind to the scholars of this organization, so much so that I get really awkward when I try to talk to most of you, so I'm really sorry about that. But that's what makes this such an honor. I've always admired the recipients of this award in particular because it's amazing to see what scholars can accomplish at such early stages of their careers, and I dreamt of receiving this award without thinking that it would actually ever happen, so to be here is pretty amazing. I have to foremost thank my nominator, but also my former advisor at Clemson University, David Ranking. He does such an amazing service to this profession and the way that he prepares his students. He gives so much time and energy to them. I am certain that I would not be here without his support. And I'm also really thankful to my current institution, Iowa State University, because they do an incredible job of supporting early career faculty, and I've had the opportunities that I've had because of that institution as well. And so thank you to the committee for just considering me worthy of this, and it's just such an honor. Thanks.
I would like to introduce, congratulations, Amy, and I'd like to introduce Cynthia Lewis, who will introduce our speaker this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Rupert Wegerif. Dr. Wegerif is, somehow the name, the W at the beginning is giving me trouble. I'm sorry. Dr. Wegerif is Professor of Education at the University of Exeter, UK. I'm told that he has a 15-year-old son, I heard, who loves Miami Vice. Is that right?
No, it's Dexter.
Oh.
I have to get pictures of all the sites where Dexter found. Do you know Dexter? Yeah. Where he found body parts and things in Miami.
Well, it was relayed just a little bit off, but nonetheless, the idea is.
Generation, Brian.
That's right. That's right. I thought Miami Vice was a little too familiar to me. But at any rate, I know he's hoping his dad will go to Miami, right, and report back. And apparently with these the spaces for the body parts. And this seems highly unlikely given the distance, but it is relevant to Dr. Wegerif's work about the role of media and communications technologies as expanding the space for learning. Dr. Wegerif's research focuses on the potential and the dangers of the internet and the still emerging internet age. He heads the Research Center for Teaching, Thinking, and Dialogue and is co-editor of the journal Thinking, Skills, and Creativity. He is also the author of 9 books and too many refereed journal articles and book chapters to count. Dialogue and dialogism are at the center of Dr. Wegerif's scholarship. From research on collaborative talk in classrooms in the interest of creative thinking to scholarship on chat spaces and other forms of computer-supported dialogue. In reading his scholarship, one senses his openness to the perspectives of others, the way that he seems to practice a dialogic stance in his own work, always attempting a generous understanding of the voices of others and a genuine questioning of his own assumptions as he moves into new ways of seeing and being. He is very deliberate in his use of the term dialogic as he works through the assumption of a complex multivoicedness inherent in any identity formation. In his recent book, Dialogic Education and Technology, Expanding Spaces for Learning, he argues that dialogism allows us to, and I love this quote, face forward and creatively design the future, working with the constraints inherited by the past, but not determined by the past. In a sense, then, Dr. Wegerif is both a historian and an explorer. He is a careful observer and theorist of the ways in which our concepts of literacies have changed and challenged us as educators in the age of the internet with an eye always toward continuity. He moves us forward by looking backwards. We are lucky to have Dr. Wegerif with us today to help us work through what literacy means at this particular juncture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rupert Wegerif to LRA.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's marvelous to be here. I think I've got a little bit of a suntan just from walking on the beach, which, if you know what the winter's like in Devon, where I come from, it's just such an opportunity to break up the endless darkness and drizzle. And it's also, of course, a pleasure to be asked to talk to you. So I'll just share my own thoughts on the connection between dialogic and literacy and its relevance for the internet age. It's obviously work in progress, and I'd very much appreciate your comments. It's because my name is unusual, Wegerif or Wegerif or Wegerif, or I mean, I don't know myself because I was born in Dartford. My father was born in Utrecht, so I never could pronounce it properly. But it's easy to find, so just, you know, if you don't like what I'm saying, please email me and I can find out more. I thought I would just look at what I think is the essential dialogic distinction and where it comes from, and also, in a slightly provocative way, look at the role of literacy education in what I'm thinking of as the closing down of the Western mind, how we actually lost awareness of this important dialogic distinction, and how radical it is, because a lot of people, including myself, when I started off talking about dialogic, I talked about it in a rather loose way, you know, to do with dialogue and children talking in classrooms. But I think if we think through what we mean by dialogic, not just dialogue, but dialogic as a technical term, it has very radical implications. So I'll try and bring those out and see how we can apply that theory to understanding the significance of this shift to the internet as increasingly the dominant mode of communication, and to how we could understand changes in literacy and the future of literacy. Of course, it is, you know, inevitably I'm putting forward a position which I'm aware is, you mentioned the downside of the internet as well as the positives. I'm being very positive today, so do remind me of the downsides. I'm aware. I kind of feel sometimes it's important to put a position, you know, and I'll leave it to you to put the other side. It's only, you know, one point of view. So let's go back to the beginning. It's not really the beginning, but Western philosophy often grounds itself on Socrates. And Socrates, interestingly, was very much an oral thinker. A lot of people have mentioned this in the context of the internet because of his criticism of writing. So when people criticize the dangers of the internet, they often refer to Socrates, but quite often it's a slightly superficial way. You know, he was kind of defending his oracy, defending the value of memory and how it was destroyed. But I think if we look at what he actually is reported to have said in the Phaedrus, it's more interesting than that. One thing to point out is that he was very much not just an oral thinker, but he typified in many ways characteristics that we find in oral thinking everywhere in the world today and in history. He listened to voices. It's very clear at his trial that he had a chat with his daemon who guided him. And in some Greek texts, it's presented as a little owl sitting on his shoulder who was talking to. He's reported as going into trances and talking to voices for hours. He took the advice of the oracle at Delphi that he was the wisest man in Athens because he knew that he didn't know anything. He took it very seriously indeed. And I just get to point out that his dialogic theory that was then picked up later by Bakhtin, who was a classical scholar, scholar, very much comes out of that experience of oracy, which is an experience that is quite hard for us to recapture and understand on the other side of our literacy education. But he basically pointed out that the dangers of texts is that they take meanings out of relationships where words are meant for somebody and treat them as if they were things in themselves. He reported that this was like planting seeds on flagstones in the sun. They would inevitably die outside of the context of relationship. I think this is quite interesting. Because in a way, this is the dialogic distinction, the distinction between words on the inside of a dialogue where they have meaning within relationships to words being treated as if they were just things, external things in themselves. And this was, I think, pretty much picked up by St. Paul, this distinction between the letter that kills and the spirit that gives life, because he was talking about words in the warm breath of speaking together with others, the breath in Greek being pneuma, which is another translation for spirit. And as I said, I think it might be hard for us to actually understand where he was coming from, because literacy does change the brain. I know everything changes the brain, and this might imply that I'm using some sort of master language, some sort of reductionist language. I don't think so. I think neuroscience is very helpful as another voice in the dialogue to give us analogies to understand what's going on. I'm at a conference in Exeter, I introduced Stanislaus de Haan, and his research in this area is really fascinating. One of the most interesting things is, of course, that literate people tend not to be able to distinguish words because, in the flow of talk, you tend to go straight to meanings, and they don't actually hear words. How come we can hear words? Well, the visual cortex is also involved in hearing and decoding language because we can see them. If you're illiterate, you can actually, and I tend to do it now, you can see the words and you can then isolate them and treat them as things. And this is a huge difference. There are many other differences. For instance, in oral people tend to be, and I say oral people, I mean people really where there's no literacy, in purely oral cultures, tend to be much better at face recognition. They're better at holistic thinking, linking things to the whole context. Whereas, of course, literate people are better at analysis. The point being that in order to recognize all these words, part of the visual cortex is being colonized by literacy. That's one point. But I think this bigger point about it's only with literacy that we can start treating words as meanings, concept words, for instance, as if they were things, separating them, analyzing them. And that, in a way, is the danger. I mean, that allows for the possibility of a monologic illusion. The monologic is, obviously dialogic doesn't really make a lot of sense except as a contrast to monologic, the idea of a single true perspective on things. And the idea that one can represent the truth and put it in a book, on the library shelf, for example. And this wasn't always the case. Stephen Toulmin wrote an interesting study, Cosmopolis, where he located the beginning of this idea of reason, this modernist idea of truth as a proof, thinking as a proof rather than a dialogue, in around about the 16th century, in the switch from people like Montaigne, who was very much a dialogic thinker. He referred, used the to form. He said, just between us. It was like he was chatting over the garden fence with the readers. And it was fascinating and very profound studies. But then you get Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz and Newton, and they're all trying to produce this idea. It's not just a dialogue. It's not just voices in a dialogue. It is a proof. We're trying to reduce every difference to the equality of the equation. At the end you have an equal sign. And of course, a modern system of education, mass compulsory education, is very much based on that monologic model. It seems as if the importance of the dialogic distinction pointed out by Socrates has been completely forgotten. It's dominated by the technology of print. I mean, you might think, well, why did this happen only in the 16th century? Well, this is when, of course, after the Gutenberg, books became spread. You had all these Linnaeus and his taxonomies. That was a bit later. But you had this possibility of focusing on representations and the idea of the truth as something that you can store in books, on library shelves, you can transmit to generations. I'm probably being a bit unfair on E.D. Hirsch there, but you get this, this idea that there are only these things that everyone needs to know, these 5,000 concepts we need to teach. This is rather different from the idea of drawing people into a dialogue, which clearly was Socrates' method. But this, what is the effect of this literacy? Well, one thing I wanted to point out was that this is not necessarily natural. It has been constructed, it's fairly recent, and in a way, dialogic education used to be the human norm. In oral societies, education wasn't about representing things and then transmitting them so you can unrepresent them, as it were, in an exam. It was about inducting people into dialogues with living voices. And you get this in almost every oral culture. They have initiation ceremonies where you get to meet the ancestors, the voices of the tribe. I particularly like this example from South Africa, where David Lewis Williams from Witwatersrand unearthed a lot of ethnography where German ethnographers in the 19th century had spoken to the San people who had painted these amazing pictures on caves. This eland is particularly beautiful. But some of the pictures, well, they hadn't necessarily painted them, but they'd participated, they'd used them, they'd been in that culture. And some of these paintings are as old as the paintings in Europe. If you know, in the caves in Lascaux and Altamira, 30,000 years old. And so it's fascinating to see how they were actually used in practice, because there had been this theory, which I think is a slightly neo-Vygotskian socio-cultural sort of theory, well, more Leontiev, activity theory type theory, that these were tools for production, magic tools. You painted the bison because that helped you hunt them in some way. But actually that wasn't the case at all, and David Lewis Williams proved it not only with the ethnography, but also with studying the bones at the cave at certain times, because it was pretty clear that this eland, for example, painting wasn't used as a magic tool. It was a voice, it was a spiritual energy. And they would gather without the use of drugs, just breathing and a bit of drumming. They would get into trance dancing, and at key moments, you'd touch the eland, and the spirit of the eland would enter into you. So the cave walls were alive. You could walk through them. And of course, mostly the eland spoke to them. It wasn't just a picture. It was an icon. It was a living voice. It was painted, incidentally, at full moon with the blood of an eland mixed with hematite. It was a living thing. And of course, in extreme cases, they described how the what do they call it? The growing of the hair, when the shaman, or many of them were shaman, it wasn't like an elite position, women and men, were actually totally possessed by the eland and would become the eland, which probably explains, in all the cave paintings, you have men going around with horns and so on, because they actually participated in this. So I just wanted to contrast that model of education as actually drawing people into a relationship with a living voice. It was a voice of wisdom and cunning, actually, that could help you in times of crisis, to a model of education as transferring knowledge that was stored in representations. And I would rather think it's probably more fun to get in a trance dance and talk to elands than it is to sit in classrooms and, read stuff you might not be interested in. So I guess I'm hoping, I'm suggesting, in perhaps a rather simplistic way, a three-part model of history, that the internet can to some extent restore this possibility of education as a living dialogue with living voices from what I see as the temporary error of monologic, the distortion, not in any way forced by literacy, but by the combination of the affordance, the potential of literacy plus education, the way in which education, a social practice of education, actually tends to enforce a monologic vision through its right and wrong answers, and particularly the way that science is taught. But of course, not everything was wonderful in face-to-face societies. They were dialogic, but because, as you saw with Socrates, this, in a sense, mystification of the breath, of the face-to-face relation, they had all this wisdom and ethics within small communities. But almost every small-scale society refers to itself as the people. When you actually ask, what does that name mean? It means, well, the humans, And it's not that surprising, therefore, that there was tended to be endless war with the others and quite a lot of, so it wasn't a universal ethics. And as many people have pointed out, without writing, it's actually very hard to understand what a universal, abstract, ethical imperative would mean. I mean, it's something that occurs in face-to-face relationships. If you're in dialogue with someone, there's reciprocity. You take their position, the golden mean. But if you're not in dialogue with them, who are they? Where are they? Not everyone would see the eland talking to them. They'd see it on the cave, it would mean nothing. Whereas writing, of course, has tremendous power because it enables you to abstract your truths from the context, from the particular cave, to put it in books, to convert people in other countries. And it tends to be associated, the first writing I think was Hammurabi's law codes, put in a stelae in every town. It's associated with the universal law of empire and so on. There have been a lot of studies of this by Harold Innes, who was the teacher of McLuhan at Toronto. So it has power, and it has indeed spread around the world, but it also has supported, particularly through print literacy, this alienating illusion of monologism. So the internet combines this ability to transcend space and time that writing has, because it's mostly a print medium at the moment, and it's global, with the participatory affordance of oracy. So let's see what we can do with that. But this is just another way of presenting the same argument in a slightly more network science kind of way. And this, incidentally, this is a map, there are many ways, a map of the internet. But if you think about oracy, it's oracy within a bounded community. Writing is a one-to-many. Now, of course, writing is very simplistic in a way because they have these pamphlets in the 17th century in England. You have the newspapers. You have the creation of a public sphere. Writing can be used to support dialogue, but on the whole, it affords this one-to-many control nature where the laws are printed at the center. Whoever controls the printing press tends to be able to print the textbook and control the curriculum. So these are affordances of technology which have actually influenced the way people think and the way education is conducted. That's the argument. So that was just a brief summary of the argument so far, so I'll move on. I don't think I'm doing too badly for time. So monologic is essentially a construction not just out of literacy, but out of school education practices. It has this idea of truth as a representation of reality. So truth isn't here in our experience and relationships, it's over there, maybe in the library shelf. And the physicalist vision is particularly, unfortunately, this scientism, which I find a bit disturbing because it's such bad science, but you'll frequently get people referring to the bottom line. So that, with the neuroscience, that everything can be reduced to a single physical vision of the world. Thinking, where does this come from? Because it's been at least 100 years since proper physicists believed that. With Niels Bohr and so on. Karen Barad's very interesting on the quantum theory and the dialogic construction of reality, which is not an anti-scientific position at all. So why do people believe that? And you just got to look at how science is taught in schools, because it's constantly drummed into them. And the implication, of course, is all this mumbo-jumbo about voices is very primitive animism, and we've moved beyond that. But in reality, that's just a kind of weird religious position. And that's reinforced endlessly in school. I mean, it's a weird... For instance, sorry, I don't mean... I'm deviating from the script. But, if you think about it, this idea we have that a voice only has to be you have to learn that. I mean, I learned that my hand is different from the podium. The body is also constructed within some kind of field. We actually inhabit a world of meaning, and we're born in a world of meaning, and we have to learn this idea that things don't have voices. They obviously, why do we know that the voice is coming from in here and not from out there? It's not that obvious. So it's just it's become enforced. But where is it enforced? Who enforces it, apart from the psychiatrists and the people who lock you up? School constantly reinforces this nonsense. So what I'm talking about here is how literacy education has closed down the Western mind. And I think it's quite important. Where I'm coming from, I suppose, is I went to school and I came out rather depressed. Everything seems so meaningless. And I think that's serious. I mean, the main cause of death of young people in England is suicide, and there's massive depression. Sorry, I'm switching tone there. I feel we should take some responsibility for this. Is there some possibility that education could actually induct people into meaningful lives rather than just, producing stuff and making money and whatever? So So that's the story of how literacy has been a bad thing, just to contrast to all those stories of how literacy is wonderful. So what is dialogic, and where does it come from? What does it really originate? So, well, one simple definition that's derived from Bakhtin and people like Rupert and Per Linnell in Scandinavia is that the meaning of an utterance depends on its location in a dialogue. And in a way, that's a very obvious observation. I mean, in a dialogue, if you lift an eyebrow, that could be significant. The word you use, there's some words in some contexts, you do different words in another context. Its meaning isn't abstract and universal, it depends who you're talking to. Exactly what Socrates said. He said you can't just take words out of relationships and put them in a text. That'll kill them. I mean, he turned out to be wrong, but it's, that's the point of dialogism. And so you can summarize that with this nice quote from Voloshinov, who worked closely with Bakhtin in Russia in the 20s, that meaning is like an electric spark that occurs only when two different terminals are hooked together. And that's how we often use dialogic, but I think I'd like to go slightly further, because if you unpack the implications of that, there's more than just, say, you imagine two or three people talking together in front of us. We've actually got to look at the situation of dialogue, moving back from the idea that there's this master view, this external, fixed, empirical view. You'll find that in a dialogue, the person you're talking to, is also the outside. Actually, I got this from Sartre. There's a lovely bit. I think Sartre isn't really listened to so much these days, but he just describes how he's having a nice time in the park, and then someone else comes along, and suddenly he's closed down because he sees himself from their eyes. And I thought that's a very real phenomenological description of what happens, because in relationship, you are enveloped, enclosed within the vision of the other. So just as you construct them within your field and within your horizon, and you define them, you know that they're defining you. And that's why they transcend you at the same time as you transcend them, which is why dialogue is, people actually respond very differently to other selves than they do to things. This is very clear in all the research, because other selves are centers of their own universe, which means that the self-other relationship in a dialogue is also an inside-outside relationship. Or as Merleau-Ponty refers to this as the chiasm. He talks about a mutual envelopment and intertwining. But I think this is essentially builds on that dialogic idea, but it takes it slightly further. The chiasm is Merleau-Ponty drew this more from his attempt to understand perception, but he did apply it to dialogues. A nice example, in Devon we have all these moors very close to where I live, and have these sort of tors on them, and if you stand up in a landscape, you can see a flat landscape like that, you can see a horizon form around you, and it's unique to you. It forms from where you've constructed it, but at the same time you feel yourself located by that horizon. You know yourself from the horizon. And Merleau-Ponty is saying that this is always the case with perception, that actually there's a certain reversibility, that we're on both sides of that. Okay, we out and we feel as if we're only on one side, but we know ourselves to be located by that horizon that looks at us. And early on he talked about this as the body world constitute each other, but in his later notes, perhaps influenced by Gilbert Simondon, who's very interesting, he began to realize that the body itself was constructed within this field and through this process. I don't know if Lakoff is talking tomorrow, but what I read, he was wonderful and inspiring stuff about metaphors, but he still seemed to have this bottom line of the body, as if the body is the really real. But the body is also constructed, so in what space is that constructed and how is it constructed? Well, I'll just do a simple, this again is inspired by Simondon's understanding of the ontogenesis of the individual, but actually I did this long before I'd read Simondon, so maybe it's my idea. It's my attempt to understand Derrida, and it's a simple diagrammatic representation of the difference between monologic and dialogic. So with a monologic theory, you tend to start with this idea of identity. So this little circle represents an identity. And you have the principle of identity, which is often attributed to Aristotle, but when I tried to read Aristotle, which is remarkably easy because you can just look it up on the internet and you can Google identity and things like that, you can search, it's great. I couldn't find the principle of identity anywhere. There was some discussion of how objects in space couldn't both exist in the same place at the same time, and presumably they derived it from that. But Leibniz articulated this in the form A equals A, and A is not equal to B, which was the foundation of his logic and classical logic, and that's known as the principle of identity. But what is, so obviously the self there, or the identity, is distinguished from the other, but what is that which is not being thought here? How can we just start with that position? Where does this thing come from? I could pause for a second and let you think about it, but the answer's fairly obvious, that someone or something or somehow you had to draw that boundary in the first place. How did it get there? How did that identity emerge? So it starts with this process of differentiation from the ground, of the self from the other, of the here from the there, etc., which implies that there also has to be a prior space of some sort, space being obviously a loose metaphor, a potential for meaning out of which identity is carved. Derrida refers to this process in Off Grammatology, looking at Mallarmé's understanding of his own poetry is based on not so much on the black marks, but on the white spaces between them, the page having this pregnancy, this white page having this potential for all kinds of meaning until you carve it down. So where does that leave us? Well, when you understand that, when you realize that, and you see that the identity doesn't just exist on its own, it can't just be isolated, it's not, as we've seen with literate brains being good at analysis, you can't actually separate it from its ground. It only makes sense in relation to its other. Just as the concept of I only works in relation to a you. So that in carving that identity out, you actually realize it doesn't equal itself. It's precisely a mediated existence which depends on the other. And while it might not be able to say it equals the other, it participates in the other, which in a sense is the alternative dialogic way of looking at things, which is dramatized a bit by Bakhtín's little story in his introduction to his last book of essays, that the ancient Greeks didn't know the most important thing about themselves, that they were ancient Greeks. So this sounds very abstract and philosophical, but it's actually, I started thinking about this in order to understand what I saw going on in classrooms, in order to understand the importance of dialogic space, which is part of the title of this conference. Because dialogic space is not an empirical physical space. You can actually see it sometimes closing down in classrooms. You can see it opening up in classrooms. It does seem to have real dimensions. But ultimately, it's something, transcendental is perhaps a dangerous word to use, but it's the technical meaning, of course, is a precondition of experience rather than something in experience. In order to understand what's going on, you need to hypothesize a dialogic space, but it's not actually visible, it's not tangible. So what is it? I'll just explain, and in a way that white space of Mallarmé, that space of pregnancy and potential, links to the real nature of dialogic space and where dialogic comes from. I'll just refer back to some work I did a long time ago with Neil Mercer and Lynn Dawes, teaching children to talk productively in classrooms. And I measured this, my fault. I got reasoning tests, and we did them in groups before and after, so we'd get an actual measure of was their talk successful or not. Now, I keep meeting people who say that all we did was teach them how to do reasoning tests, and well, we didn't. They did every kind of thing. They talked together in small groups. They did literacy, and indeed, insofar as one can measure these things, they wrote more creative texts together, and this was very effective in every area of the curriculum. I was going to say apart from the 100-yard dash, but I know some PE teachers who are very keen on dialogic talk as well. And it's got good results, but this was a way of measuring it. And the beauty of it was, of course, we could see them doing exactly the same problems before we did our 10-week training in exploratory talk and afterwards. So we could look at how they solved problems afterwards that they were unable to solve before. There were many cases of that. Of course, we had control groups and we did it properly, but the video analysis was interesting. And the argument that we were assuming, a very neo-Vygotskian stance, influenced by Neil, was that talk is a tool for thinking. You know this idea? So it's a social mode of thinking, so if we're teaching them ways of talking, that they're effective in problem solving, that's teaching a cultural tool, and they're learning how to use that cultural tool. I saw some of that. I mean, there's some truth in that. But more importantly, I saw the opening of a dialogic space. what distinguished the successful groups from the unsuccessful ones wasn't their use of strategies, but it was the shift in their orientation. In this particular group that I showed the picture of, they started with this disputational approach. So they had Tricia and Gary and Susan, who was very quiet, and Tricia and Gary vied for, she just, I didn't show you the text, but she just said, yeah, it's this, and he said, no, it's not, yes, it is, and they solved it in the end because he grabbed the pencil and wrote the answer. Obviously, they got it wrong, they hadn't really thought it through. So this is what we call disputational. But if you think about it, what's happening there is that they're identifying with a limited vision of themselves, a defended vision in opposition to the other. And we also had groups where they didn't criticize because they had this fixed vision of the group, the harmony of the group. So you don't challenge it by telling someone they're wrong. These are two, monologic, objectified visions of identity. So what was happening when they solved the problem? Well, there were lots of clues in the talk. But I didn't know how to describe this in terms of identity, and it's then that I put forward this idea that they're identifying with the dialogue, that a dialogic space is opening up. And this was back in the 90s, so since then I've been trying to understand what I meant. And I've been making progress. I hope you agree, but there's still a way to go. It was very significant because, for instance, in that talk, which I might come back to a little bit later, you'll see that it isn't actually the words of the other child that forces Tricia to change her mind. It's when she hears herself speaking. So when Gary asks why, he's not seeing it from his point of view. It's opening a pause as a space. And in the successful groups, you get these pregnant pauses where they're all focused, and then an idea emerges. Usually one person gets the insight, and then they share it. The language is crucially important for sharing ideas, but it didn't seem to stimulate them. What seemed to stimulate them was just opening this space. I call it a space of reflection, but that's a better idea is diffraction, again from Karen Barad, because reflection is a rather monologic idea, isn't it? The light bounces off, you can calculate it. But what happens in a dialogue, when you open that space, is more like a diffraction pattern. Waves going through slits. You get some reinforcement, you get some chaos, you get new things emerging, and that seemed to be crucial. But in that, of course, it's not just the voices of physically incarnate children that are heard. This was an example, from my point of view, in some video I analyzed from America, from Rich Lira and Leonie Schnabel. And there were children talking around a graph they had to draw. I won't go into the details, but it was interesting for me because these two girls had a big argument. And then, I hope I've got the bigger picture there. Yeah. And then this girl with the dark hair, she changed her mind. And it was beautiful to see because she enacted it fully. She kind of was away from looking down. She was quiet. And then suddenly she went, raising her eyes, opening the eyes. And I said, I see now. So I thought, well, how did she change her mind? So I looked back. There didn't seem to be a verbal reasoning, but the other girl had stood up and said, and done this gesture, inviting somebody in. We're saying, look, come in and have a look at this. She'd been referring to the audience. In the future, someone's going to look at this graph, and it's going to make sense to them. And that explains why we want to draw it this way and not your way. It struck me that's really interesting, because that's invoking an absent voice, another. And that's crucial for literacy, I would have thought, this bringing in the audience. You're not just writing for each other, you're not just writing for yourself. How do you manage to write for someone who's not there, for someone who you have to imagine? I don't know, do you not have this struggle when you're trying to write journal articles? How do you actually engage with these absent people? So there are other voices in this dialogue than just, there's a tendency for this physicalism. You've just got these physical, voices are attached to physical bodies. I'm not convinced, actually. And even in this little dialogue I just showed earlier, if you look at how Tricia changes her mind, I mentioned it before. She asserts one thing, George says, what do you mean? She changes her mind. There's a pause, she changes her mind. Who's she talking to then? I mean, where is that voice? Is that all? Because there's certainly two voices. There's the initial Tricia, and then there's the Tricia listening to what she's saying and changing her mind, which is in a way bringing in this third position that Bakhtin talks about. He says that in every dialogue, as well as the people talking, as well as me trying to persuade you, there's a witness position, there's a super addressee. And he says, yes, that in every age, in different cultures, they will create the super addressee differently. It might be the voice of God, it might be the community of scientists, but there's always some sort of super addressee. I'm not sure, but I suspect that that's a simple consequence of this listening to yourself talking effect. Because, you know, as I'm talking, I'm not only talking, I'm listening to myself talk, as if I was other to myself, thinking, does that make sense, you know? And so there's a ratcheting up. People call this metacognition. I have this, I constantly need to drink all the time when I'm talking. I think it's nervous, but, you know, don't really understand it. Because I don't feel nervous. You know, do you ever get that? Symptoms of, anyway, we're lost in ourselves sometimes, aren't we? At least I am. So the point is that the point is that I'm criticizing I've been criticizing, hopefully in a constructive way, sociocultural theory, because for me dialogic comes out of sociocultural theory, but it is a criticism. Things aren't all cultural mediated tools. Opening a space is a very different notion. Now I'm criticizing this idea, well, George Herbert Mead's idea of the generalized other, which appears here in Accountable Talk from Resnick and people. And it makes sense in education that you want to invoke the voice of the community. You want to be accountable to the community, so you're learning science. And in a way, that's this idea of it's a particular form of the super addressee. But isn't there something in thinking that means that you should be able to challenge the community, that you should be able to talk to other communities? Again, Lev and Wenger, this situated learning, they kind of argue that in order to think at all, you have to be in a community. You can only understand people because you're inducted into knowledge in a community. So how do you ever question the community? How do you ever talk to people outside of your community? Is it not possible? I think it is possible. And that's where I introduced, beyond the generalized other, on Accountable Talk, this idea of the infinite other. And here's a simple diagram of how it might work. I mean, if there's a third generated every time you're in a dialogue, if you construct your super addressee as a particular form of God in a particular time, well, then surely that generates another super addressee. Surely there's always another perspective which could question the assumptions you're making about what is good reasoning. Perhaps there's a woman in the Amazon basin who has a different view. You should be open to the possibility of that voice. So there's this infinite regress when real thinking takes place, as opposed to merely, you know, thinking like everybody knows how to think. You know, this is a reasonable thing to say because everyone in my community thinks is reasonable. You can actually learn also to go beyond that. And that's a potential in every dialogue, which is interesting because it's, well, let's look at this idea of infinity. I actually took this idea from Levinas, the infinite other, but he introduced it in an ethical context. He was arguing that beyond Western ontology and so on, which he claimed was just all egology, there was this idea that what we've been doing is representing other people instead of relating to them, so that we can build a model of other people so we think we understand them, but it's all within our system of representations, and that is, well, ethically dangerous. He was coming out of a Holocaust situation where he'd lost all his family, and he was being somewhat critical of German philosophy, understandably. And he was suggesting that in the face of the other, there's an ethical appeal that goes beyond representations because they transcend my capacity to understand them, which we mentioned earlier. It's a symptom of a dialogic relationship. They transcend me because they locate me. So how can I understand somebody who, you know, is an agent who situates me in their world? There's obviously a transcendence there. So he referred to this as the infinite other, and he always associates it with the real. That's why I put a couple of faces there. You know, the face of the other, the face. But he's obviously talking about more than just one person. He's talking about, as a principle, it's the response, the ethical call that you see in the face of another human being. And he referred to this as the context of meaning, la signifiance même de la signification. And this is this idea. So if we think about what it would mean to shift from thinking in terms of representations to in terms of relationships, he is offering here a new understanding of what we mean by dialogic space. It's not just these representations. I tend to representations. I kind of like physics and maths, and I'd like to draw some sort of fancy diagram of how things work in 5 dimensions, you know. But But that's not really the point. You create your Klein jar with a Mobius strip that, those sort of diagrams, and you put it on the mantelpiece. You say, that's lovely, isn't it? I've created a model of everything. And what he's trying to say is, actually, that's not how it works. In a dialogue, it's not actually possible for me to cross over that threshold. We can't represent that threshold, that difference between you and me. It's a gap. It's a gap in our possibility of thinking, of representing, and yet there is a relationship. And how does it feel from the inside to allow yourself to be called out by the other, to actually enter into that relationship? I think that's the real challenge of dialogic theory, actually. How do we shift from representing others to relating to others? But the infinite other, I've kind of twisted this from Levinas's ethical context and applied it to a cognitive context, because I also think it's not just about the face of the human being. Scientists I know have actually, I put in Einstein, that was mentioned a lot in the talk yesterday, I rather like Einstein, they're actually motivated by just the appeal of the otherness of the other, and they want to understand it. And it's not just about ethics, or maybe it's ethical, but it's just the fact that we are participating, we experience ourselves in a large, apparently interconnected system that transcends us, and yet, so in order to understand, we're in relationship with otherness, and that is like a call for many people. How do we understand this? How do we relate to this? It has a cognitive dimension as well, and it's a way of understanding this dialogic space idea, as the infinity of it, the potential infinity of it. So just to summarize, I think I've still got 20 minutes to go from where we started, so I just wanted to summarize this. Obviously this sort of binary distinction doesn't seem very dialogic, because we're trying to get away from binary thinking, aren't we? But at the same time, how do you understand dialogic except in a contrast to monologic? It's the way thought works. And so I've just tried to run through some of what I think are the key differences, that just from the Greek word, actually in terms like diacritical, it means through and across difference. So it's logic. That's why I like the term dialogic, because it has this resonance of logic. It's logical, but it's a different kind of logic. It's a logic that implies difference and through and across difference. Whereas monologic, as it sounds, is just there's a single voice. There's a single true representation. And in dialogic, there's not just two voices. There are always multiple voices in play to understand the meaning of anything. Whereas monologic claims that you can, this is Leibniz really, but I'm sure others do, that it's all about reducing apparent difference to the single true perspective. This is often what science seems to be trying to do, or mathematics seems to be trying to do. But the meaning of signs depends on the context in a dialogue. So a meaning of any utterance, any sign at all, can only be understood in the context of who's speaking, why they're speaking, what it's trying to achieve, and of course you can't pin down the meaning because it's between you and the other. So if you think you're trying to say one thing and everyone else thinks you've said something else, it's quite hard to say, well, I didn't mean that. You still find yourself in court or whatever, because people don't always believe you, because the meaning is actually constructed between people in a dialogue. Whereas the monologic view is that you can actually, and you see this in a lot of coding schemes, that things just mean what they mean regardless of the context. And also, which I think is rather interesting and challenges this binary dichotomy, is that ideas of progress and learning in dialogic are moved by augmentation. So we're not just saying, I was criticizing sociocultural theory and situated learning theory, we're not just saying this is the true version and that's the false version and we'll throw it away. It's more like in a dialogue, if you meet somebody and you discover their point of view on the world, your point of view is enriched, it's augmented, it expands. You don't just move forward in a linear fashion. Whereas monologic tends to suggest that progress is linear. Wrong views are just replaced by right views in science, but also in education. And as I said, we're shifting. The dialogic is about relationship with others and with otherness in general, whereas monologic thinks we can represent them. And that leads to this sense of infinity, not infinity in a complex mathematical sense, but in the simple sense that it's not finite, it's not bounded. That we're always beyond it, whereas monologic implies a totality. But of course, we can't make this simple binary distinction between monologic. Monologic is not the enemy, it's not a bad thing, it obviously has great power. I think the best way for me, or it's just my little image of it, is when we had these children talking and we tried to find a way to evaluate the successful talk from the unsuccessful talk in the context of solving non-verbal reasoning test problems. the single best indicator was the length of utterances, because they were explaining things. They weren't just responding, they were explaining, oh, because of this, and look at that, And so, in a way, the monologic increased. And you see this in good science, don't you? I mean, Einstein spends a long time on his own thinking up an amazingly consistent theory, and then he puts it to the audience, and they criticize it, and he goes away again. It's still a dialogue, but it contains these big utterances instead of little utterances. It's not as if they're in opposition to each other. The problem is when you get confused and you imagine that the whole thing is monologic. That when you have a dialogue that isn't on the internet by Twitter, when you can see it's a dialogue, but when it's, somebody writes a book and 100 years later you write a book, you can get into this illusion that the truth is in the book and that it's not a dialogue, if you see what I mean. So they're not, anyway, I'll expand on that very briefly in a few minutes. But first, I've been talking for an awful long time, so I'm now going to see if I can apply this theory to the internet, and I will start by hopefully having a little music that somebody sent me from YouTube that I put here, which I rather liked. So hopefully you can have a brief pause, if it works. I don't know if the sound's going to play, though. Chad, are you there? I don't know if you've come across this. Someone sent it to me. I thought it was rather nice, so I'll share it with you. It's one of those memes, I suppose. Good. Okay, so you get the idea. I found that when I looked into this, not only was I find it very beautiful, but I was also fascinated by, if you look at the blogs that surround it, what happened was Eric Whiteacre, got volunteers to participate in this choir, to sing his music. So he sent them the scripts, and all those people were playing in their living rooms, in their bedrooms, uploading their song, which he then turned into this internet event. And some of the nice stories. There's a woman in Alaska who claims she lived 400 miles from anybody, and she, it really meant something to her to participate like this in a communal endeavor. If you saw all the separate voices, the separate bedrooms. And what excited me about this was, well, what does it say about meaning? And what does it say even about causality? Normally, we have this idea that music occurs somewhere. So you have a concert in the Royal Albert Hall in London, and you record it, and you put it on a CD, and you send it to other places. It has a place, and it has a time. But here, where is this event? This is a musical event. I hope you liked it. I quite liked it. But when is it? Well, I say it's on the internet. Well, where exactly is the internet? Of course, some people, if we take this physicalist, as I say, slightly silly master narrative that there's only one reality, you can say it's fiber optic cables, it's servers. But that's not our experience of cyberspace, is it? It's a space of relationship and possibilities. Where exactly is it? And even if you take that physicalist view and you say it's code, in the cloud sort of age, no one really knows where that code is. It could be anywhere. It's pretty hard to pin down. So the where is complex. And the when, well, the when is quite simple. It's whenever you press that play button on YouTube. That's when it is. It doesn't exist any other time. And isn't that interesting? Another thing that's interesting is the causation. And you could say it's caused by, in a forward, normal fashion because he sends them the script and all the rest of it. But really, they're actually caused to sit there in their living rooms playing the music by the future event. It's the possibility of this future event that they want to participate in that motivates them. So that's a kind of retro causation, isn't it? It's caused by the future. I feel that the internet, that part of the reason why dialogic theory is coming up now and all that post-structuralism, postmodernism that I referenced, is because our experience of reality is different, because the internet has changed our experience. I mean, we are, constantly zipping around the world and finding ourselves in different places and so on, and playing games with my son, who's 15, as I mentioned earlier. He used to endlessly play games with lots of other children from around the world. So experience of space and time and reality is potentially quite different, and we need a theory that can explain this new situation we find ourselves in. And I think dialogic theory can be helpful, especially in an educational context. Just briefly, another issue. I saw this picture of Earthrise shown with the NASA tape at a conference recently. And the person who presented it said, of course, well, we couldn't be there to see it, and perhaps people can see that now if they're very rich millionaires. I think she's thinking of this Richard Branson venture where you can pay to go out into space and see. And I think that's a bit odd, isn't it? Because I feel like I've seen this. I saw it as a child, and it really moved me. And I just think it's interesting the way in which we've become alienated from our own technology. So we'll say that, what is it to see this? If you're up there, presumably you've got a helmet on and you're using a camera. I think they're making planes now that won't have any windows. Oh, thanks. Yeah, they won't have any windows. They just have cameras and screens. And so are they really there? Are they looking out of the? Are they looking out? If I was to have a drone flying by there with a camera, am I there or not there? I think that the issue here is actually our alienation from our own technology. We're happy to say that art and literature, that's part of us, that's the expanded mind, but any mediation by technology, and we say that's not us, but actually it is us. This is our body, these are our eyes. It's a shared reality that we're inhabiting. And I found that instantly on the internet, and it's interesting. So I suppose what I'm suggesting is that there are signs that the internet offers a possibility to something that we can learn from the experience of oral cultures, that there's an element of the cave going on here, that the internet isn't just a physical space, it's this opening into a living relationship with cultural voices. When I saw that Earthrise as a child, I was moved by it. I felt a call. I wanted to be a spaceman. I didn't end up there, but these things are not simply physical. And this does come out of a change in literacy practices, I would argue. I'm not saying it's technological determinism, but I think it's a major driver in this evolution. And the change in literacy practice is very clear when we look at things like the shift from print encyclopedias, I don't think any are being printed now, to the use of Wikipedia. Exeter is still quite a conservative university, and I still hear people, saying you shouldn't use Wikipedia because anyone could write it, it's not really the truth. And the idea of course, encyclopedia is that the editor selects the expert in the subject, so it's the truth. You go there to check things up. Whereas with Wikipedia, you really ought to learn to check your sources because you can't be quite sure who's written it. But actually, the latest research suggests that not only is it more up to date than any print source, but also it's more accurate. Inevitably, more people are checking and correcting things. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't check. So in order to use it, you have to participate. You don't just read it and say that's the truth. You participate in the construction of knowledge, even in the mild way of checking things. So that's just so that it kind of summarizes the dialogic move that the internet brings in. But of course, it's not just a return to the dialogic of Socrates and of oral societies. Bakhtin's dialogic was very much about text, dialogism in text. He just looked at the voices in Dostoevsky's text and the way they interrelated to each other and had dialogic relationships independent of Dostoevsky. So it's not just verbal face-to-face dialogue, it's also increasingly multimodal. The music, the videos, this is all part of the internet-mediated dialogue. But something else quite interesting is a new kind of dialogue that emerges, which is centered to horizon dialogue, where the horizon is a community, is a living community. So it's not just face-to-face, Socrates talking to a Phaedrus, nor is it just me and the internet. There's something in between, which is particular communities that you discover whenever you Google anything. Whenever you try and look something up, you'll probably find, this might be an answer, but there might be a community discussing it. My mother, who's 81, lives on her own in France, and she's researching the family tree. Her name's Cochrane. And there are a lot of people who are researching Cochrane, so she found other people, and they started emailing and sharing their references. You know, they found this gravestone, they knew this reference. And learning on the internet is inevitably like that. You're in a dialogue with a community. You might not know them, and that's a new skill. How do you learn from that kind of dialogue? So I think there's a new kind of dialogic going on, which is very significant for education. And the community isn't a closed community. It's flexible and open and of uncertain boundaries, but it's not simply the whole internet. So the internet, there's an emerging new model of education. Many of these examples, they might, like the MOOCs, many MOOCs and the Khan Academy, they might be recreating traditional education, but there are also quite a lot of situations, like with the initial MOOCs with George Siemens, where the idea is that people produce resources for each other, people learn together. I particularly liked in Mexico, in the Tec de Monterrey, they're running over 3,000, I think there's some in America. Thanks. Some in America. What are they? Centros Comunitarios de Aprendizaje, where you can just go there, there are computers, they're in many rural areas, you can go there and you can learn. You can't learn anything at the moment. They tend to be sort of basic literacy in courses. There are no teachers, there's just someone who encourages you, who makes a note of where you're going, who guides you on the resources. But potentially, with these massive amounts of really good educational materials out there, open educational resources, you could really learn anything through such centers. So, or just, that's centers for people without computers at home. So what's stopping them? Well, the research on MOOCs suggests the vast dropout rates are related to people who aren't very good at social networking online. There are certain skills you need to learn in order to make the most of this. I must say, I shouldn't say this, but my son is amazing. He can learn anything. And it's not because he's very clever, but he Googles things, and then he emails people. And so I set him any kind of challenge, and technical challenges like, what's wrong with the Wi-Fi, or can you set up a website for my... And he'll solve it. But then he shows the tutorial that just walks you through. It's just amazing how informal education has been transformed by the internet and how formal education hasn't caught up. I just want to briefly mention this one example in South Africa I came across, because I like the way in which it's the forming of one of these cult voices in education. There's a community of volunteers who will sit manning keyboards, and they get texted by anyone who's struggling with their maths homework. Now, they might not have a lot of smartphones in this poor townships in South Africa, but practically everyone in the world now has a text phone. There are as many text phones as there are human beings. And so they can text their maths problem to Dr. Math. And Dr. Math, who's one of the volunteers, will respond and solve their problem. And I just think that's just an interesting way in which these avatars, these voices are emerging on the internet in an educational context. And something else I wanted to point out is there's this illusion that agency is this individual thing, we want autonomous learners, but actually that's not how agency works at all. Agency comes from engaging in dialogues. It's from responding to a call. So if you want to learn something, you need to be pulled out by an interest, by a passion for that, not pushed forward by fear of failing the exam. And so it's not actually an individual thing. It comes from to get agency, you need to put yourself in the way of a flow of meaning. You have to allow yourself to be open to the call of another or others, to be caught up in a dialogue. And this is an application of dialogic theory which is sometimes overlooked and is interesting. But teaching does have a role, of course, because teachers can open that space of possibilities in the classroom which allows children to be caught up by voices, to experience a call, a possibility. And then, of course, you can encourage them, you can support them. That's the idea of Sugata Mitra's Granny Cloud, by the way. They don't teach anything, they just encourage. There are a lot of people on the internet who will encourage children in whatever they're interested in. So it's a possible new model here emerging. I might run slightly over time, but I'll be nearly there. As people looking at so there's a question of what is actually happening. I mean, apparently teens, this is a Kaiser family study, fairly recent, but they spend all their waking hours apart from, this is interesting, when they're at school or when they're asleep, they're connected. Well, they're on gadgets that could be connected. Not everyone is connected, but they're with electronic gadgets. And this possibly leads to different kind of experiences and different kinds of identity. I particularly like this. There's a demonstration with these people wearing the anonymous masks, but they also have this "We Are Legion." It does seem to indicate the potential identity that comes when you spend your life on the internet, because you're not one person, you're all sorts of people, you're fragmented, and yet you participate, yet you feel an identity with the collective. It's kind of interesting what's happening. And how does this relate then to, well, politics, shall we say? I mean, I haven't mentioned politics and power, but there is this, in fact, the monologic is an illusion that's imposed by power. It's about the authoritative voice. It's about setting limits, not allowing people to go beyond them for various reasons. Implicit and in Bakhtin's dialogic theory was this idea of great time. Every dialogue interconnects with every other dialogue. In a way, there are lots of situated dialogic spaces, that's true, but in a way they all interconnect. There's actually only one dialogic space ultimately, this space of pregnant possibility underlying reality, because, I mean, I personally associate it with the quantum foam. I mean, this is real, and it's not, and space and time come out of divisions we create within that underlying design space or dialogic space. Where am I going with this? Well, there's an intuition in language that all the dialogues interconnect, that everything interconnects, and previously we've had this in various mystical writings, but Bakhtin created this idea. He was interested, how come I can read classics from ancient Greece, and it makes sense in the context of Russia? How come all these texts can interrelate? Every dialogue. How come we can learn from Confucius and we can learn from Socrates? It's extraordinary. And he suggested there's this chronotope of great time, where every meaning has its homecoming ceremony, as he put it, where no meaning dies. And the internet is obviously a sort of concrete and limited incarnation of that concept. It's making a reality of the complex unity of humanity that he was talking about. And as I say, where exactly is this space? How is it possible in physical reality that we could have an internet? I mean, what makes it possible? What kind of a space is it? So I would suggest that this indicates what Derrida's concept is relevant, the democracy that is to come. He's not talking about a particular set of voting practices. He's not something real, something that could actually happen. It's more of a promise, of a tendency towards surely we all feel this need to make decisions globally on the basis of understanding and dialogue, not just on who happens to have the most power and the most weapons at any given moment. And that's this ideal that is informed by internet communication, I think. So for Bakhtin, education was out of our narrow preoccupations towards an awareness of great time, towards an awareness of the eternal and infinite context of everything that's happening to us now, and doing that through dialogue, of course. I think I've just about finished. Yeah. So very briefly, sorry, slightly over. Am I? Yes. No, not really. Oh, yeah, maybe. Sorry, I am. Can I just a couple of minutes? Okay. So there was talk this morning about global citizenship. So one thing to realize, it's not just our identity concept of citizenship, where the British make nasty comments about the Germans and they feel better about being British and that sort of thing, because there's no boundary with the internet and with the future, and it's not about just the one rule of law from the centre imposed by law codes. which is why I get worried about all this discourse of human rights. There seem to be a few well-meaning people in Geneva or in New York, and they have, these are the human rights, and anyone who doesn't sign up to them is obviously beyond the pale, and we can't. It's just a traditional print literacy empire approach, and yet this seems to be the best liberal democratic approach we have at the moment. But the internet actually offers another possibility, which would be a global dialogue, a dialogue of the local and the general and of everyone with everybody, so we can negotiate contextual situations. How is that possible? It's only possible if people have a dialogic identity, if they are open to the other, if they are able to listen. It doesn't mean they all sign up to some law code that some well-meaning liberals somewhere have told them they have to. So global citizenship becomes rather different. I suppose a key thing I was going to say, that a dialogic identity is rather mysterious because it's about, at the same time as you're able to talk, you're able to listen. You're able to actually recognize that your identity has two sides, that you identify with the dialogue at the same time as being a position within the dialogue. Does that make sense? So there is such a thing as a dialogic identity, but it's not the same as this identity principle that we talked about earlier. So what does all that have to mean for the potential for dialogic literacy education? Well, I don't really know. It's just a suggestion. I hope it's helpful. But clearly, the new literacy of the internet and of digital literacy is not about one medium or another. It's about how do we find a shared communication across all these media, because oracy, literacy, video, music, and people have talked about this transliteracy, the new literacy idea from Donald Lewis, very interesting, and that's very important. So what does dialogue add to that? That actually this takes place in the context not just of communication, but indeed of dialogue with specific others, generalized others, and also ultimately the infinite other. And the twist that gives is the important thing isn't necessarily training people how to encode or decode in any particular medium, how to use PowerPoint, how to use literacy. Obviously that is important in context, those are specific literacies, but more important is learning to be open to otherness and to the other. Because unless you actually hear the call, unless you're motivated and you want to respond, then literacy has really no point. It's about being able to share yourself with the rest of the world and feel called to do that, how to participate in these global dialogues that shape our lives. And teachers can help, as I said, by opening spaces that allow students to feel that call of meaning and encourage and support them as they learn to respond to that call. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Rupert, for stretching our thinking. And I now invite everybody just out the door to the Salon F for the town hall meeting.